I define myself as being a narrative historian. For me, uh, history is about people in the past, people's actions, the things they do, they believe. This is what create what we call history. So I'm engaged in, like most historians, I'm engaged in writing stories about people's actions, stories about people in the past, trying to understand what they did, why they did it, and the impact that they had on the world. In my historical work, there's quite a big emphasis on alternative possibilities, the different possibilities in the past. Whenever people say that things that have happened in history were inevitable, I'm immediately questioning that. Nothing is inevitable in history, at least in a kind of an absolute sense. There's always alternatives. There's always other possibilities. There's always choices to be made. So when I'm looking at the Second World War, one of my major topics, obviously I engage. I tell stories about about Second World War. But the most fundamental stories I tell about the Second World War, or any history I do, is the stories of the people themselves in the past. Yeah, okay, I'm a historian. I tell stories about the past, but the people in the past, they had their own stories. Like we do in the present, telling themselves about what they were doing and why they were doing it. So the most important narratives to grasp about history are not the stories told by historians, but the stories told by people in the past themselves, right? And it's those stories that I try to render as accurately and as interestingly as possible. Okay, and that's why another feature of my research of all narrative historians, is very, very big emphasis on evidence, on documentation, on empirical research, because it's evidence that enables us to reconstruct, recapture, represent what people were thinking in the past. What they were thinking in the past, why they did what they did. That's the most important thing. It's not our speculations about the past or about them. It's how people saw themselves at the time. Second World War is a big event. Yeah, you've got a lot of choices to be made. There's lots of possibilities. The one that came to my mind was this, which was a meeting between Stalin, the Soviet leader Stalin, Joseph Stalin, and Anthony Eden, who was the British Foreign Secretary, and a meeting they had in Moscow in December 1941. And at this meeting, Stalin presented Eden with a proposal for a secret treaty between Britain and the Soviet Union, right? So a secret treaty. And what the treaty was all about, it wasn't about the war, it was about the post-war order. Basically, Stalin proposed to the British that after the war was over, there should be a restoration of the pre-war international order. Yeah. Basically, and there should be a return to the kind of state system and international order that had moved out of that emerged out of the First World War, right? So Stalin's, it's a very conservative perspective. Stalin's a communist. Stalin's a Marxist, a radical, a revolutionary, and he hadn't actually given up his ideology. But here he is, basically proposing, a very conservative outcome to the whole war, the restoration of the status quo. That's what he's proposing, because he sees the restoration of that status quo as being the best possible context for the Soviet Union to protect itself. And he also thinks that within the context of that status quo, the communist Soviets can continue to pursue their ideological goals as well. But Stalin, in adopting that stance, is basically adopting the same position that had already been adopted by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt of the United States, and Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, a few months previously, in August 1941, when they had a meeting which came to be known as the Atlantic Charter Meeting, in which they proclaimed their war aims. And again, the fundamental war aim was to actually beat back the challenge to the existing international order, and to basically to protect post First World War peace settlement, right? So the war is about a lot of things, right? And there are many different radical outcomes to that war. But fundamentally, what the war is all about is what is the future of the international order? Is it going to be like the international order from the recent past? That's to say, an international order based on states, based on their sovereignty, based on their common institutions, right? Is that what the war is going to produce? Or is it going to be the order that Hitler and the Axis states want to produce? And what they want to do, they want to actually overturn the existing order and replace it with kind of global imperial order. In a way, they want to, the Axis powers want to go back to the situation before the First World War, when world politics was dominated by imperial states. And that imperial world had been destroyed by the First World War, and in its place there came a fully fledged state sovereign system. And Hitler and his allies, the Japanese, the Italians, other states, wanted to overturn that post-First World War state sovereign system and replace it with their own imperial project. So I think Stalin's embrace of that status quo is a very, very important moment in the crystallization of what the Second World War was all about. If you're talking about Western myths of the Second World War, the most prevalent myth, generalized myth, would be something along these lines, that the primary victor of the Second World War was the United States, right? And the primary outcome of that war was the so-called rules-based international order. And the history of the post-war world is a history of the United States protecting and developing that rules-based order, which then triumphs in the post-Cold War years in the 1990s, right? And it's that rules-based order is now under threat, right? Is being destroyed by states, Russia, China, other countries, which want to undermine that rules-based order and replace it with their own order. Okay, so that's the Western myth. So the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, other countries, it was a broad coalition that won the war. As I was saying earlier, it wasn't a war for a US-led rules-based order. It was a war for the re-establishment of the state sovereignty system, right? And that goal was achieved, right? And that goal was actually embodied in the United Nations and its charter, which is basically, and the United Nations was the successor to the League of Nations, and both the League of Nations and the United Nations are organizations of sovereign states, in which sovereignty is the central element of their makeup, right? So that was one, and the other outcome was that it wasn't going to be a rules-based order led by the United States. What there was going to be would be a concert of great powers, yeah, a collective hegemony of the great powers, primarily United States and the Soviet Union, but also Britain, China, France, and other countries. So there was going to be it would be a great power unity, which would preside over the post-war development of this state-based system. Of course, that didn't happen. It didn't happen because after the Second World War, you got the Cold War, right? And that's what comes after the Second World War. It's not this rules-based order. That's an invention of the 1990s. You get the Cold War. You get the development of these Cold War blocs, including a United States-led Western bloc, which eventually comes to define itself as being the whole of the international order. It's only after the end of the Cold War, early 1990s, that this Western bloc comes to see itself as this so-called rules-based order. And what that means that they want to universalize their rules and their values, their hegemony, and their power system. And that is what they attempt to do in the 1990s. The fundamental outcome of the Second World War is the restoration of the sovereign-based state system, right? The defeat of the Axis attempt to overthrow that system, right? And in connection with that, there are all kinds of treaties signing, including the establishment of the United Nations, right? So that's the fundamental structure that emerges from the war, right? And actually, it's a structure that persists, right? Okay, it comes under threat because of the Cold War division and polarizations. And later on, it comes under threat and challenge by, Western and American global liberal hegemony in the 1990s, right? But nevertheless, throughout the Cold War, the fundamental nature of international politics based on this sovereign state system persists, remains the same. And it does that for a number of reasons, including reasons connected with the Cold War itself. So one of the reasons that the state system persists and persists as present day is because of the process of decolonization, the post-Second World War process of decolonization, where you get the emergence of a number of new independent states. I mean, many of them form part of what we now refer to as the global south. In those days, they were referred to as third world or developing countries. But anyway, those new states were committed to a sovereignty-based state system. That is what they wanted, because that empowered them as being members of that system, rather than being continuing their colonial domination. So that was very important. The other important factor in maintaining this state system, despite the Cold War, despite the Western project of basically trying to dominate it and change its very character, is the post-Second World War rise or re-emergence of China. China was and is one of the foremost defenders of the sovereign state system. Obviously, every country has its own memory and narrative connected to the Second World War. Some of them are victim narratives for sure, but by no means all of them. Okay, and those memory histories are actually quite complicated. You could have a long discussion about each of them. Okay, but let me say something about the one I'm most familiar with, which is the Soviet Union, right? Okay, and so the Soviet Union's fundamental narrative coming out of the war was that they had won. Yeah, they had won the war, and the war had proven the strength of the socialist system in the Soviet Union. Also proven the strength of the Soviet Union as a multinational state, a multi-ethnic state. So it's not just it's a Soviet victory, not a Russian victory. It is a Russian victory, but it's also a broader Soviet victory as well. So it includes ethnic groups that are not Russians. It's the myth is, and it's true. It's one of these myths which are actually true in broad sense. It's a story of victory, a great sacrifice, yes, of course, but a story of victory, of actually a very heroic story. And on the basis of that myth, the Soviet Union as a state is refounded, yeah. So because originally the Soviet Union arises after the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik seizure of power. So it's a revolutionary state. It's a socialist state. That's what it is. Well, okay, and it remains a revolutionary state and a socialist state to a large degree. But after the Second World War, the state comes to be the rationalization for the state, the Soviet state I'm talking about, comes to be seen the victory, the great victory in the Second World War. That is its justification for its continued existence. But here's the thing: there's quite an interesting thing happens connected to this in terms of what subsequent develops, because you might expect that the Soviet Union, having won this great victory in the war, greatest military feat of arms in history, without doubt, greatest victory in the greatest war in history, yeah, the greatest battles, yeah, sure. You might kind of expect arising out of that a kind of enhanced militaristic identity for the state, wouldn't you? You might expect that militarism to come to the fore, but that doesn't happen. What actually happens is that there is a change in the Soviet state's self-identity as an international actor. I'm talking about in the international arena, but it's not in the direction of militarism or military glorification. It's in the direction of the Soviet Union redefining itself as a peace-loving state, right? That's the fundamental identity that emerges on the basis of Soviet historical memory of the Second World War. Okay, and partly it's an identity based on the trauma of the war, the great sacrifice, and obviously the natural desire not to repeat that catastrophe of war. But it also arises because of the development in the early post-war years of a significant peace movement, an anti-war movement, anti-nuclear movement, and this is a global movement, including in China. In China, there was a huge peace movement in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it's the activities and discourse of this peace movement which has a huge impact on the Soviet Union itself, because there's a very strong domestic Soviet peace movement, as there is in China as well, by the way. But there's also an international peace movement, right? So it's the impact of this peace movement has on shifting the Soviets to a position where they define themselves as being, okay, they're a very strong power militarily, they have the atomic bomb, they're a superpower, but fundamentally a peace-loving state. And they're going to achieve their goals, their national goals, political goals, ideological goals, through peaceful means, right? Through the struggle for peace, right? And the Soviet Union's adoption of that peace-loving identity, it seems to me, is very, very important to help us understand why the Cold War didn't develop into a hot war. And in the 1940s, when the Cold War breaks out, no one believed it was going to go on for 4 decades. Everyone thought that in the near future, actually, the Cold War will become a hot war. There will be an actual war. There will be a Third World War. Okay, that didn't happen. Didn't happen for many reasons, including the existence of nuclear weapons. But it also didn't happen because the Soviet Union stepped away from that kind of idea. It was a peace-loving state. It was going to struggle for peace, and it was going to achieve its goals through the stuff of peace. And here's another sort of general thing to always remember about the Soviet Union or its relationship to the Cold War, is that the Soviet Union was always against the Cold War. The Cold War was a Western struggle. The Soviet Union struggle was against that. They were always striving for détente, for peaceful coexistence, to end the Cold War, which they saw as being dangerous, of course. So the Soviet Union's, so it's a kind of paradoxical effect, the great military victory in the Second World War, but what comes out of that is a peace-loving identity on the part of the Soviet state, and the struggle for peace being the main avenue of policy, not militarism. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, very much the architects, that very much the Americans, the United States. So they reflected American thinking about the post-war economic order they want to see after the Second World War. It was basically based on kind of capitalistic free trade kind of concept. So it's very much Bretton Woods and reconstructing the post-war international order. So there's no return to the kind of tariffs and protectionism of the 1930s. Very much an American project. But actually, quite early on, there are discussions about the Soviet Union being part of that system. Yeah, being members of the IMF and of the World Bank. Being participants in the so-called Bretton Woods system. Okay, and that does happen. It doesn't happen for various reasons, but mainly because Stalin is suspicious, he's worried about too many Western influences bearing down on the Soviet Union in the post-war. So he sees it as potentially being threatening to Soviet sovereignty if the Soviet Union got too involved in these Western-led international economic institutions, right? But having said that, the Soviets remain interested in trade and economic cooperation with the West. And in fact, there's one particular episode which is to do with the so-called Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, which was the American plan for the economic reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. When the Marshall Plan is first devised, it was a plan that was open to the participation of the Soviet Union and also of the Soviet Union's allies in the Communist bloc in Central and Eastern Europe. And in fact, the Soviets, Moscow, Stalin, are kind of interested in that possibility, in the possibility of actually receiving Western aid to help them reconstruct the Soviet economy, and they engage in some serious talks with the Western powers about this. Okay, but they come to Soviet Stalin comes to the conclusion that actually this again is another threatening Western initiative, right? It has ulterior motives. So they decide that they are not going to participate in the Marshall Plan funding, or nor are their communist state allies going to do so others. And in fact, it's really post the Marshall Plan, or as a result of the Marshall Plan, that the post-war split between the Soviet Union and the United States develops into a full-blown Cold War. Okay, so there were alternatives immediately after the Second World War in the form of an international economic system of a different character from the one that actually emerged, and also of the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc countries being actually much more closely integrated into the world economy. But that didn't happen again because of the Cold War. But that possibility was there. Going back to the 1950s, there was this idea that post-war history. Okay, you have the Second World War, then you have the Cold War, in which you have a bipolarity. Yes, right. Then the Cold War comes to an end. Then you have unipolarity, right, in the form of United States domination. And then after that, the period we're in now, you have the emergence of multipolarity. So bipolarity, unipolarity, multipolarity. But the world was not as bipolar during the Cold War as it's sometimes seen in retrospect. In the 1950s, there was the Bandung movement, right? China was involved in that, which was asserting kind of independence by developing countries in the context of the Cold War, exercising their sovereignty. So, and indeed, like using the Cold War conflicts and Cold War rivalries of the Soviet Union and the United States to actually strengthen their own position. So throughout the whole Cold War period, throughout the whole post-war history, the global South has been exercising its agency and its sovereignty. Yeah, but of course, obviously, in more recent years, that exercise of power and sovereignty by the global South has increased. It's increased as American and Western power and domination has decreased. It's increased as the global. There's been a shift of economic power in the direction of various global South countries. I think above all, it's increased because of China's emergence as a dominant world economic power. Right? Don't underestimate the importance of China and the role it's played in enabling global South countries to actually exercise their sovereignty and power. And of course, that's part of the ongoing process, which is why, of course, many global South countries are very happy to participate in the BRICS, alongside China and the Soviet Union, Russia, because they have actual experience of how good relations with China, with Russia, can actually enhance their own sovereignty. Global initiative is effectively, as far as I can see, a call to strengthen the institutions and practices of state sovereignty, state-based system, and its international systems and international law and diplomacy and multilateralism. Yeah, it's just a set of principles that basically mirrors the traditional principles of state sovereign system. It's that state sovereign system is one of the things over which the Second World War is fought for, and it's one of the things that comes out of the Second World War and survives the Second World War. So that's a direct legacy. The Second World War, post-war period, China, of course, re-emerging and actually becoming one of the main exponents of that state sovereignty-based system, and its power increasing all the time, down to the present time, where China feels strong enough to actually lead what it calls a global initiative. It's part of our practical history, in terms of continuity of events, continuity of actions, right? And also continuity in terms of our thinking about the war. The parade is a celebration of the end of the war, celebration of the outcome of the war in terms of defeat of Japan, as well as the other Axis countries. It's obviously a display of China's power, particularly military power. But quite visibly, it's a display of, a group of sovereign states, big and small, coming together for mutual benefit, and also to project to the outside world that this is the way states ought to relate to each other, right? Celebrating common achievements, expounding common values. So obviously, celebration is not just a historical celebration; it's very, very much an important geopolitical event, evidenced by the huge amount of coverage in the Western media of not just the event, the parade today, but also, of course, the Shanghai cooperation meeting as well. Huge kind of coverage. So, even in the West, it's dawning on them that there's this huge new power developing in the world. It's a development for which obviously China can benefit. China's a self-interested power like any other power, as well, in fact, can benefit all states by creating a stable, state-based, sovereign-based international system based on the United Nations, based on international law, based on diplomacy, based on multilateralism, and based on collaboration and cooperation across national boundaries. Obviously, the Ukraine war is another quite complex phenomenon, isn't it? There is a Russia-Ukraine war. There's also, within Ukraine itself, there's a kind of civil war that's been ongoing since 2014. And then there's also been ongoing, still, unfortunately, a proxy war between Russia and the West, which has been fought out in Ukraine. So it's quite a conflict in many ways. And the Russian kind of framing of that conflict is also quite complex, and that's different kind of angles, right? So in terms of Russia's war with Ukraine in the internal Ukraine context, right, within Ukraine itself, it's very much framed in terms of being an anti-fascist war, isn't it? An anti-fascist war against a kind of ultra-nationalist or fascist regime based in Kiev. And it very, very directly draws upon the same kind of themes and propaganda that was used during the Second World War, during the Great Patriot War. So that's one framing of it, or it is as an anti-fascist war. But actually, just like during the Second World War, or when the Soviet Union was conducting its anti-fascist struggle against Germany and its allies, so it's always very careful that to frame this as a war against regimes and against political leaders and militaries, not against the people. So it's the same in the Ukraine war. The Russians frame it. It's an anti-fascist war, but it's not a war against the Ukrainian people as such. And of course, there are many Ukrainians themselves are quite sympathetic to the Russian perspective, right? Okay, but the other framing of the war is kind of the geopolitical framing of it, isn't it? And geopolitical framing of the war by Russia it's a war for its continued existence, right? It's a war to fend off dire threats from Western countries who at the very least want to diminish Russia as a great power, and at its worst, most radical, would like to see the breakup of Russia as a unitary state. So there is a geopolitical framing of the proxy war with the West in Ukraine as being very much an existential struggle for Russia's survival. But again, there's an interesting point to be made about that, is that, the Russians do frame it as a war for their survival, but they don't frame it as a zero-sum struggle, which also entails the destruction of the West. It's not. That's not what's at stake. It's a struggle for Russia's survival against Western pressure, whatever threats, ambitions, and so on. But it's they don't see the outcome of that struggle having to result in the destruction of the West itself in any form, right? In fact, the way they see the outcome of that struggle is, and it goes back to the theme of our conversation, is the emergence of a new multipolar world order, right? Okay, in which Russia will have its place, China will have its place, all countries will have its place, including the West. So it's a rather, in one sense, the Russian geopolitical frame of the Ukraine war in relation to the proxy war to the West is quite like a kind of apocalyptic kind of perspective. They're threatening our very existence. They want to destroy us, right? But on the other hand, they're saying, but they're also saying, well, they're not going to succeed. We're going to win this war. And one of the things that's going to come out of this war geopolitically is a new set of international relationships, right? But it's a benign set of international relations in which the Western countries will be a part. And there's another interesting point to make about that. So of course, the framing of the war on the Russian side has shifted recently, hasn't it? Since the election of Donald Trump as US president, right? So more the geopolitical framing in terms of the existential struggle is more directed at European states than it is against the United States. And the Russians have also embraced the possibility of a complete reconstruction of Russia's relations with the United States, because they also see, Putin and Russian leaders, sure, they're committed to this concept of a multipolar world order, which I would argue is just another version of the traditional state sovereign system. They're committed to that, but they also understand that within that system, there's a particular role to be played by the big powers, by the great powers. It's not in power terms, it's never going to be an equal system, right? Some states are stronger, some states are more important, more influential, can have a bigger role. That's inevitable. The question is what role that they can play. And the projection is that they can play a relatively benign role, in which they look after their own interests, they look after themselves as big powers as well, but they can also foster and protect the interests of other states. Going back to your earlier question about the connection with the memory of the Second World War. Of course, that was the perspective that emerged at the end of the Second World War. That was the perspective. They were fighting to defeat Nazism, Japanese militarism, Italian fascists. They were fighting for democracy. They were fighting, revive post-First World War, peace settlement state system and all that. But they were also fighting on the basis that going forward, the new post-war order would be based on collective global hegemony of the great powers, who would actually police that order, protect that order, stabilize that order, not just in their own interests, of course, but also in the interests of other states. So that if you're talking about the Russians, there's a kind of continuity from that Second World War situation. It's often referred to as the Yeltsin-Potsdam perspective, right until the present day. And in the United States case, re-embrace of that perspective, right? Because, that was Stalin's perspective at the end of the Second World War, benign global hegemony of the great powers. But it was also the perspective of the American president, Roosevelt. President Roosevelt. That was his perspective as well. So there's a kind of return to the Rooseveltian idea that great power collaboration was necessary in order to have a stable, secure post-war international order. And it was also possible, the most important point, it's also possible because it was possible to actually collaborate with the Soviet Union. This is and with Stalin. And in fact, Roosevelt's belief was that if we cooperate with the Soviet Union and Stalin, they can become more like us. More Western, more capitalistic, right? There could be a growing together. So that was Roosevelt's perspective. You jump forward to the present day, I think the Americans have a similar kind of perspective, is that if they could develop a collaborative relationship with Russia, Russia could become more like them, and hence less threatening to them. And the Russians, for their part, have their own similar position there. But of course, the big difference between now and the situation 80 years ago is that both Russia and the United States are both capitalist countries. They're capitalist countries. In economic terms, they operate in the same way. Many, many different values. Russia is not a socialist country or a communist state anymore. So there's no ideological gulf between the United States and Russia, like there was this ideological gulf between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the possibilities for collaboration, for working together as part of a multipolar multilateral world order are much greater, actually much easier in principle than they were after the Second World War. Firstly, they should strive for mutual self-understanding, right? Mutual understanding. And the way they should do that is by making an effort to see the world through the eyes of other powers, other countries, through the eyes of other people, right? That's the fun. You can't have mutual understanding unless you have kind of empathy. Yeah. Yeah. The exercise of empathy, right? So exercise your empathy. See the world through the eyes of your different people, different countries, different states, different governments, different leaders, and the result that can be mutual understanding, right? That's the first point. The second point is exercise mutual self-restraint. That's to say, don't just strive to restrain the actions of other players, powers. Strive to restrain yourself. Restrain yourself. That should be your priority. Restrain your own actions, right? Because it's self-restraint is probably the most important influence and factor impacting on others, other countries, other states. Yeah, yeah, self-restraint. Yeah. Okay, so that's the second point. Okay, and the third point is to create a system in which there is. Okay, the third thing is to prioritize the overall balance and character of the situation. Prioritize that over your own particular interests, or even the particular interests of the great powers themselves collectively. Yeah. So focus on the common good, the good of the system as a whole, right? And the way to protect the common is to make sure there is a balancing of interests and ideas, and a respect for diversity and a pluralistic outlook on the conduct of international affairs. And the final thing to say is that kind of thing, okay, that might seem like a rather kind of utopian, idealistic set of propositions to make, to demand of great powers. But that's in the past when we've had peace, when we've had good relations between great powers, which have been mutually beneficial, but also more generally beneficial. That's the kind of politics and diplomacy that they've actually created and conducted with each other. That has been the case in the past, in the 19th century, for example, but also during the Second World War itself, right? And also during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, there were periods of daytime which promised to actually end the Cold War and actually establish a whole new way of doing business with each other. And again, the kind of things I identified was you can actually see in what was going on during these periods of daytime. So yeah, history is all about what's happened, but history is also about being able to recognize, identify possibilities in the past, but also possibilities in the present and in the future.